in the twilight hours of the Roman Republic, when corruption had become currency and principle had become performance, one man stood alone. Not because he was stronger than others, not because he was more intelligent, not because he possessed some superhuman quality that set him apart from his contemporaries. Cato the Younger stood alone because he refused to bend, and that refusal, that absolute commitment to virtue in a world drowning in vice, would make him both Rome's greatest hero and its most tragic figure. Picture this: it is the 1st century before the Common Era. Rome has conquered the known world. Its legions march from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Syria. Wealth flows into the city like water, transforming it from a republic of citizen farmers into an empire of unimaginable opulence. But something has gone terribly wrong. The very success that was supposed to perfect Rome has begun to destroy it. The conquest of foreign lands has corrupted the conquerors themselves. Generals return from campaigns with enough gold to buy armies of supporters. Politicians auction off their votes to the highest bidder. Ancient traditions that held the Republic together for centuries crumble like parchment in flame. Into this world of moral chaos steps Marcus Porcius Cato, great-grandson of Cato the Elder. That stern old moralist who ended every speech with Carthage must be destroyed. But while his ancestor fought Rome's external enemies, the younger Cato would face something far more dangerous: the rot within. He would become the living embodiment of Stoic philosophy, not as an abstract intellectual exercise, but as a political weapon, a moral stance, and ultimately a form of resistance that would cost him everything. What makes Cato's story so compelling, so devastating, and so relevant to our own time is not that he was a good man in a bad world. History is littered with good men who accommodated themselves to corruption, who made their peace with injustice, who told themselves that compromise was wisdom and that survival was success. What makes Cato extraordinary is that he refused every single one of these comfortable lies. He looked at the greatest empire the world had ever seen and said, "This is wrong." And then he spent his entire life trying to stop its descent into tyranny, knowing full well that he would fail. This is not a story about success. It is a story about the meaning of failure, about what it means to stand for something when standing accomplishes nothing, about whether there is value in resistance when resistance is futile. It is a story about a philosophy that taught its followers how to be free even in chains, how to be victorious even in defeat, how to be human even in a world that had forgotten what humanity meant. Cato was born into privilege in 95 BCE, into one of Rome's most distinguished families. His great-grandfather, Cato the Censor, had been famous for his rigid morality, his hatred of Greek luxury, and his relentless campaign against corruption. That legacy hung over the younger Cato like a shadow, but it was a shadow he would grow to embrace with an intensity that would have shocked even his austere ancestor. But Cato's early life was marked by loss. His father died when he was young, and he was raised by his uncle, Marcus Livius Drusus, a reforming tribune who tried to extend citizenship to Rome's Italian allies. When Drusus was assassinated for his efforts, the young Cato witnessed firsthand what happened to those who challenged the established order. This was his first lesson in the cost of principle. It would not be his last. From early childhood, Cato demonstrated the qualities that would define his entire life: stubbornness, intensity, and an almost pathological commitment to consistency. Ancient sources tell us that, as a boy, he refused to flatter his teacher even when all the other students did. He would not laugh at jokes he did not find funny. He would not pretend to enjoy games that bored him. These might seem like small things, like the quirks of a difficult child. But they reveal something profound about Cato's psychology. He was constitutionally incapable of performing emotions. he did not feel, or beliefs he did not hold. This was not the behavior of a diplomat. It was not the behavior of a politician who wanted to succeed in Rome's cutthroat political environment. It was the behavior of someone who had decided, perhaps unconsciously at first, that authenticity was more important than success, that integrity was more valuable than influence, that being true to yourself was worth any price that others might demand you pay. Cato's education immersed him in Stoic philosophy, that austere Greek teaching that had found fertile ground in Rome's martial culture. The Stoics taught that virtue was the only true good, that external circumstances were indifferents, that could not affect your inner freedom, that the wise man was invulnerable to fortune's whims because he had learned to desire only what was within his control. These ideas were not unique to Stoicism, but what made Stoicism distinctive was its insistence that philosophy was not merely theoretical knowledge, but a way of life, a set of practices, a training regimen for the soul. For most Romans who studied philosophy, it was an intellectual ornament, a mark of cultivation, something you discussed at dinner parties, but did not allow to interfere with practical affairs. Cato approached Stoicism differently. He did not study it. He embodied it. He made it the operating system of his entire existence. Every action, every word, every political stance was filtered through the Stoic framework. Is this virtuous? Is this consistent with reason? Does this align with nature and the cosmic order? This was both his greatest strength and his fatal weakness. Because once Cato had determined what virtue required, nothing could make him deviate from that course. Not threats, not bribes, not arguments about pragmatism or political necessity. He had made himself into something that Rome had never seen before and would never see again. An absolutely incorruptible man in a world built on corruption. His first major public act revealed exactly how dangerous this incorruptibility would be. In 63 BCE, when Cato was just 32 years old, he stood before the Roman Senate during the Catiline conspiracy trials and delivered a speech that would change Roman history. A group of conspirators led by the nobleman Catiline had plotted to overthrow the government, and several of them had been arrested. The question before the Senate was simple: what should be done with them? Julius Caesar, already a rising star, argued for clemency. They should be imprisoned, not executed. This was the moderate position, the reasonable position, the position that would preserve the ancient principle that Roman citizens could not be executed without trial. It was also the politically safe position because Caesar was building a coalition of populist support and did not want to appear cruel. Then Cato stood to speak. And what he said was simple and terrible. Execute them immediately. No trial, no appeal, no delay. Why? Because the Republic was in danger, and in times of supreme crisis, ordinary rules did not apply. The conspirators had forfeited their rights as citizens by conspiring against the state. To show them mercy would be to show weakness. And Rome could not afford weakness. This was not the argument of a philosopher king dispensing wisdom with benevolent detachment. This was the argument of someone who had looked into the abyss of Rome's moral decay and decided that only the most extreme measures could save it. Cato convinced the Senate. The conspirators were executed that very day, strangled in the underground prison called the Tullianum, and Rome discovered that it now had a senator who was willing to break the Republic's oldest laws in order to save it. This was the paradox that would haunt Cato for the rest of his life. He was the Republic's most devoted defender, yet he was willing to violate its fundamental principles when he judged the situation desperate enough. He was the embodiment of law and tradition, yet he could be ruthlessly pragmatic when he decided that pragmatism served virtue's higher purpose. He was absolutely consistent in his principles, yet his application of those principles could be startlingly flexible. His enemies would call this hypocrisy, His supporters would call it wisdom. But what it really was something more troubling: the recognition that in a corrupt system, even the purest commitment to virtue requires you to compromise with vice. Cato had discovered this truth early, and it would poison everything he tried to accomplish. To understand Cato's philosophy, you must first understand what it meant to be a Stoic in the late Roman Republic. Stoicism was not merely an abstract set of doctrines about logic, physics, and ethics. It was a comprehensive worldview that offered its adherents a way of understanding their place in the cosmos and their relationship to everything that happened to them. The Stoics believed that the universe was governed by a rational principle they called logos. This was not a personal God in the way that Christians or Jews understood divinity. It was more like the organizing intelligence of reality itself, the pattern that structured everything from the movement of stars to the growth of plants to the thoughts in human minds. Humans were unique because they possessed a spark of this divine reason. Our capacity for rational thought connected us directly to the cosmic order. From this metaphysics flowed a radical ethics. If reason was the divine element in human nature, then living according to reason was living according to our true nature. And what did reason dictate? That we should develop virtue, wisdom, justice, courage, and self-control. Everything else, wealth, health, reputation, even life itself, was an indifferent. This did not mean that Stoics thought these things had no value at all. They recognized that some indifferents were preferred, while others were dispreferred. It was better to be healthy than sick, better to be wealthy than poor. But the crucial point was that none of these external circumstances could affect your fundamental well-being, your eudaimonia, your capacity to live a good life. This was an immensely powerful idea, and you can see why it would appeal to someone like Cato. It meant that no matter what happened to you, poverty, exile, torture, death, as long as you maintained your virtue, you remained free. Your inner citadel, as Marcus Aurelius would later call it, was invulnerable. Tyrants could seize your property, imprison your body, even kill you. But they could not touch the only thing that truly mattered: your moral character, your capacity to choose virtue in every circumstance. But here is where Stoicism becomes deeply troubling when translated into political action. If external circumstances are indifference, if virtue is the only true good, then what does this mean for political engagement? If you are indifferent to the results of your actions, caring only that you act virtuously, how does this differ from a quietist withdrawal from public life? The Stoics had an answer to this, but it was an answer that created as many problems as it solved. The Stoics argued that humans were naturally social beings, that we had obligations to our fellow humans that flowed from our shared rational nature. We were all part of the cosmic city, the cosmopolis, and our duties extended to all of humanity. But we also had particular duties to our immediate community, our family, our city, our nation. The wise Stoic would fulfill these duties not because he expected any particular outcome, not because he hoped to succeed in changing the world, but simply because fulfilling these duties was itself virtuous. This is what Cato attempted to do in his political career. He entered public life not because he craved power or glory, but because he believed it was his duty as a Roman citizen to serve the Republic. And he served it with a single-minded intensity that both awed and exhausted his contemporaries. He held multiple offices: quaestor, tribune, praetor, each one an opportunity to demonstrate his incorruptibility and his commitment to ancient Roman virtue. As quaestor, he personally audited the public accounts and discovered massive fraud. He prosecuted the guilty with relentless determination, recovering vast sums for the treasury. He did this not to win popularity. His prosecutions made him many enemies, but because it was just. As tribune, he blocked legislation he considered harmful and fought against the growing power of military strongmen like Pompey and Caesar. He did this not because he had a realistic chance of stopping them, but because opposing tyranny was virtuous regardless of whether the opposition succeeded. His methods became legendary. He would use every procedural tool available to obstruct legislation he opposed. He would filibuster for hours, reading from texts until his voice gave out. He would stand in the doorway of the voting area, physically blocking citizens from casting ballots for measures he deemed unjust. On one occasion, when Caesar tried to have him arrested for this obstructionism, Cato stood his ground so firmly that Caesar backed down, realizing that imprisoning Rome's most vocal defender of traditional values would spark a riot. These tactics won Cato a reputation for stubborn inflexibility. His critics said he was more interested in demonstrating his own virtue than in achieving practical results. They said he was like a man trying to act as if he lived in Plato's Republic, rather than in the real Rome of real politics with real consequences. And they were not entirely wrong. Cato's political philosophy did have an element of performance to it, but not in the cynical sense that his enemies implied. Cato understood something profound about how politics works in a corrupt society. When institutions have failed, when norms have collapsed, when everyone around you has decided that the old rules no longer apply, what can one person do? You cannot restore virtue to a vicious system through clever compromises or pragmatic accommodations. All you can do is model the behavior you wish to see, knowing full well that you will be mocked for it, knowing that you will be punished for it, knowing that you will probably fail. This is what Cato did. He made himself into a living symbol of republican virtue, a walking reminder of what Rome had been before. It became corrupted by imperial ambition and factional warfare. Every time he spoke in the Senate, every time he cast a vote, every time he blocked a piece of legislation, he was performing a kind of political theater. He was saying, "This is what a real Roman looks like. This is what it means to put the Republic before personal advancement. This is what integrity costs, and I am willing to pay that cost." The tragedy is that this performance, this witness to virtue in an age of vice, accomplished almost nothing in practical terms. Cato did not stop Caesar's rise to power. He did not prevent the civil war that would destroy the Republic. He did not save Rome from itself. All he did was demonstrate that it was possible to remain virtuous, even in a world where virtue had become obsolete. And perhaps that was all he could do. Perhaps that was all anyone could do. The conflict between Cato and Caesar was not merely a clash of political ambitions. It was a clash of two fundamentally incompatible visions of what Rome should be. Two different answers to the question of how human beings should live together in political community. And because both men were absolutely convinced of the rightness of their position, because neither would compromise, their struggle could end only in the complete destruction of one by the other. Caesar was everything that Cato despised. He was brilliant, charming, ruthlessly ambitious, and completely indifferent to traditional morality. He cultivated the masses with public spectacles and grain distributions. He bought the loyalty of soldiers with plunder from his conquests. He seduced the wives of his political rivals and then joked about it at dinner parties. He violated ancient laws whenever those laws stood between him and his objectives. He was, in short, exactly the type of man who thrives in a corrupt system, because he has no moral qualms about exploiting that corruption for his own benefit. But here is what made Caesar truly dangerous. He was not merely corrupt, he was transformative. He understood that the Roman Republic as it existed was broken beyond repair, that its institutions had become hollow shells maintained only by the inertia of tradition. He saw that Rome needed a complete restructuring, that the only way forward was through the concentration of power in the hands of a single strong leader who could impose order on the chaos. He saw that the Republic was already dead, and he was willing to bury it and build something new on its grave. Cato saw all of this and understood that Caesar represented the ultimate threat to everything he valued. This was not just another ambitious politician who could be controlled through normal political maneuvering. This was someone who wanted to destroy the entire system and replace it with personal autocracy. And what made it even worse was that Caesar's analysis of Rome's problems was largely correct. The Republic was broken. The old institutions were not functioning. Something had to change. But Cato refused to accept that the solution to dysfunction was tyranny. He believed that Rome could be saved through a return to traditional virtue, through the restoration of ancient customs, through the renewal of moral commitment among the ruling class. He believed that what Rome needed was not institutional innovation, but spiritual regeneration. If men of quality would simply remember what it meant to be Roman, if they would place the common good above private ambition, if they would exercise the self-control and civic dedication of their ancestors, then the Republic could be saved. This was almost certainly a fantasy. The forces tearing Rome apart were structural, not moral. The concentration of wealth in the hands of a few, the creation of enormous private armies loyal to individual generals rather than to the state, the integration of conquered territories that overwhelmed the traditional republican system. These were problems that could not be solved by individual virtue alone. But Cato either could not see this or refused to accept it. His Stoic philosophy had taught him that virtue was the only thing that mattered, and he tried to apply this principle to politics with devastating consequences. The conflict came to a head during Caesar's consulship in 59 BCE. Caesar proposed a land distribution bill that would provide farms for Pompey's veterans. This was a reasonable policy that addressed a real problem: what to do with soldiers after their military service ended. But Cato opposed it because he saw it as part of Caesar's larger plan to build a power base outside traditional constitutional channels. He attempted to filibuster the bill, speaking for hours until Caesar, in a shocking breach of protocol, had him physically removed from the Senate and briefly imprisoned. This was a turning point. Caesar had demonstrated that he was willing to use force against the Republic's institutions, and Cato had demonstrated that he was willing to be martyred rather than allow it to happen. The lines were drawn. From this point forward, their conflict would only escalate until one of them was destroyed. Over the next decade, Cato waged an unrelenting political war against Caesar and his allies. He opposed Caesar's command in Gaul, arguing that Caesar should be recalled and prosecuted for his illegal actions as consul. He fought against the political alliance between Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, the so-called First Triumvirate that effectively controlled Roman politics. He warned repeatedly that Caesar was planning to overthrow the Republic and establish himself as king. And he was right about everything. But no one with the power to stop Caesar was willing to listen. The problem was that Cato's opposition to Caesar was so absolute, so uncompromising, that it made political cooperation difficult, even with those who shared his concerns. Cato would not make strategic alliances with men he considered corrupt, even if those men opposed Caesar. He would not moderate his language to build coalitions. He would not compromise on principle to achieve practical results. This was Stoicism in action. Virtue was the only good, and you could not achieve virtue through vicious means. You could not save the Republic by adopting the methods of its enemies. But this meant that Cato isolated himself from potential allies. He alienated moderates who might have been persuaded to oppose Caesar if Cato had been willing to meet them halfway. He turned political questions into moral absolutes, making it impossible for people to disagree with him without being cast as enemies of virtue itself. His rigidity, which was supposed to be his strength, became a weakness that Caesar exploited ruthlessly. When the civil war finally came in 49 BCE, Cato allied himself with Pompey, the lesser evil in his calculation. This was itself a compromise that must have cost Cato dearly. Pompey was no defender of republican virtue. He was another ambitious general who had bent the rules to serve his own interests. But he was opposing Caesar, and that made him useful. Cato swallowed his distaste, enjoying Pompey's cause, knowing that this alliance violated his own principles, but judging that the threat of Caesar justified the compromise. This is the tragedy of principled opposition in an unprincipled world. Eventually, if you want to accomplish anything, you have to work with people who do not share your values. You have to make alliances that feel like betrayals. You have to choose between different forms of compromise, knowing that all of them will taint you. Cato made this choice, and it must have felt like a kind of death. The war itself was a disaster. Pompey's strategy was incoherent, his alliance was fractured by competing ambitions, and his forces were no match for Caesar's battle-hardened legions. The decisive battle came at Pharsalus in 48 BCE, where Caesar destroyed Pompey's army. Pompey fled to Egypt, where he was murdered by the young king Ptolemy, who hoped to curry favor with the victor. Caesar had won. The Republic was dead. All that remained was for the corpse to be buried with appropriate ceremony. But Cato refused to acknowledge defeat. He fled to North Africa with the remaining Republican forces and continued the resistance. This was not rational strategy. Caesar's victory was total. The military situation was hopeless. Every practical consideration argued for surrender or exile. But Cato was not acting on practical considerations. He was acting on principle. As long as he drew breath, he would resist tyranny. As long as it was physically possible to continue fighting, he would continue fighting. The Stoics taught that the wise man should fulfill his duties regardless of outcome, and Cato was fulfilling his duty to the Republic even though the Republic was already dead. What does it mean to truly live by a philosophy? This is the question that separates Cato from almost every other thinker in history. Most philosophers develop elaborate systems of thought, but fail to embody those systems in their own lives. They preach virtue, but pursue vice. They advocate simplicity, but accumulate luxury. They teach self-control, but indulge their passions. The gap between theory and practice, between what we say we believe and how we actually live, is one of the defining features of human existence. Cato closed this gap. He made his life into an argument for his philosophy. Every action, every choice, every moment of his existence was filtered through his Stoic principles. This was not the abstract Stoicism of the philosophy schools, where students debated fine points of logic and metaphysics. This was Stoicism as a way of being in the world, as a set of practices that shaped every aspect of daily life. Consider something as simple as Cato's appearance. At a time when wealthy Romans dressed in fine togas, wore elaborate hairstyles, and adorned themselves with jewelry, Cato dressed plainly. He wore dark clothing, the color associated with mourning, because he was perpetually mourning the Republic's decline. He went barefoot in public. He wore his toga in the ancient fashion, without the elaborate draping that had become fashionable. He kept his hair short and his face unshaved in the old Roman style. This was not eccentricity for its own sake. It was a political statement. Through his appearance, Cato was saying, "I reject the luxurious decadence into which Rome has fallen. I represent the old values, the austere virtues that made Rome great. I will not participate in the corruption of our age, even in something as trivial as clothing." Every detail of his presentation was a calculated rebuke to the moral softness of his contemporaries. He lived this same austerity in every aspect of his life. While other senators maintained vast estates staffed by hundreds of slaves, Cato lived relatively simply. He supervised his household personally, involved himself in the smallest details of its operation, and treated his slaves with a justice unusual for his time. The Stoics taught that all human beings possessed the divine spark of reason, that conventional distinctions of status were ultimately meaningless. Cato tried to live by this principle, even though it contradicted the entire social structure of Roman slavery. His eating and drinking habits were equally austere. At a time when elite Romans spent fortunes on elaborate banquets featuring exotic delicacies from across the empire, Cato ate simple food. He drank wine only moderately, maintaining perfect sobriety while others indulged to excess. Later in his life, he adopted an even stricter regimen, drinking only water and eating only the plainest provisions. This was not asceticism for religious reasons. It was discipline practiced to maintain his independence from bodily desires, to prove that he could not be controlled by appetite, to demonstrate that his will was sovereign over his flesh. But Cato's austerity went beyond personal habits. It extended to his handling of money, and here his integrity became almost supernatural. In a political culture utterly corrupted by bribery, where every office could be bought and every vote had a price, Cato was absolutely incorruptible. He not only refused bribes himself, that was the bare minimum of virtue, but he actively prosecuted those who offered them. When he served in Cyprus, tasked with confiscating the treasury of the deposed king, he handled vast sums of money with such scrupulous honesty that even his enemies could find no grounds for accusation. In an age when provincial governorships were viewed as opportunities for enrichment, when generals returned from campaigns with personal fortunes looted from conquered territories, Cato's financial integrity was so unusual as to be almost incomprehensible. This caused problems for him politically. Romans were accustomed to a certain level of corruption. They expected politicians to engage in quid pro quo arrangements, to distribute favors in exchange for support, to use public resources to build private power bases. Cato's refusal to play this game made him politically ineffective. He could not build coalitions because he would not trade favors. He could not win allies because he would not compromise his principles for political advantage. He was like a man trying to play chess while everyone else was playing poker. He refused to acknowledge the actual rules of the game being played around him. His sexual morality was equally rigid. In a society where extramarital affairs were commonplace among the elite, where politicians routinely seduced each other's wives as a form of political maneuvering, Cato was rigorously faithful to his wife. When his friend Hortensius asked to marry Cato's wife Marcia, not to commit adultery, but to legally marry her, Cato agreed, but only after carefully considering whether this arrangement violated any philosophical principle. This incident, which seems bizarre to modern sensibilities, reveals something important about Cato's approach to ethics. He took seriously the Stoic teaching that personal relationships were indifference, that the wise man should be guided by reason rather than by emotional attachments. If allowing his wife to marry another man served a rational purpose, in this case, producing children for his friend Hortensius, then emotional resistance to the arrangement was irrational and should be overcome. This may seem cold, even inhuman, and perhaps it was, but it shows the extremity of Cato's commitment to his philosophy. He was willing to subordinate even the most intimate personal relationships to what he judged to be rational principle. This was not cruelty. It was the logical outcome of taking Stoicism absolutely seriously, of refusing to make exceptions for sentiment or conventional morality when those things conflicted with what reason dictated. In the Senate, Cato's philosophical principles manifested as an almost pathological honesty. Where other senators spoke in careful euphemisms, used diplomatic language to avoid giving offense, and concealed their true intentions behind elaborate rhetoric, Cato spoke plainly. He called things by their names. If he believed a proposal was unjust, he said so directly. If he thought a colleague was corrupt, he accused him to his face. If he judged a policy to be harmful to the Republic, he explained exactly why in terms that left no room for ambiguity. This made him terrible at politics as it was actually practiced. Politics requires dissimulation, the ability to say different things to different audiences, to appear to support positions you actually oppose, to maintain cordial relationships with people you despise. Cato could not do any of this. His Stoic training had taught him that virtue required absolute consistency between thought, word, and deed. A gap between what you believed privately and what you said publicly was a form of vice. Therefore, he said what he believed, always, regardless of consequences. The consequences were often severe. He made enemies unnecessarily. He alienated potential allies. He gave his opponents ammunition they could use against him. His honesty was a weapon that others wielded more effectively than he did because they had no scruples about how to use it. They could quote his own words against him, take his statements out of context, use his rigidity to make him appear unreasonable. Cato gave them all of this willingly, because to do otherwise would have been to compromise his integrity. But here is what made Cato's philosophical witness so powerful. Precisely because he was so obviously not seeking political advantage, precisely because he was so clearly willing to sacrifice his interests for his principles, people believed him even when they disagreed with him. His enemies knew that when Cato opposed their proposals, it was not because he was maneuvering for position or trading favors with their rivals. It was because he genuinely believed their proposals were wrong. This gave his opposition a moral weight that transcended the normal calculations of political power. Cicero, who knew Cato well and often disagreed with him, captured this quality perfectly when he said that Cato spoke in the Senate as if he were living in Plato's Republic rather than in Romulus's cesspool. This was meant as criticism, pointing to Cato's impracticality, his refusal to deal with the world as it actually was. But it was also a kind of admiration. Everyone else had become so accustomed to the cesspool that they had forgotten what clean water tasted like. Cato reminded them. He made them uncomfortable with their own compromises. He was the conscience of Rome, and like all consciences, he was inconvenient, irritating, and ultimately intolerable to those who did not want to be reminded of their failures. The Stoics had a concept they called appropriate actions, kathakonta in Greek, officia in Latin. These were the duties that flowed from your particular station in life, your role in the social order, your relationships to others. A father had duties to his children. A citizen had duties to his city. A human being had duties to all humanity by virtue of shared rational nature. These duties were not optional. They were not dependent on whether fulfilling them brought you pleasure or advantage. They simply were, inherent in the structure of reality itself. For Cato, the primary duty was to the Republic. He was born into Rome's aristocracy, into a family with a long tradition of public service. This was not merely a matter of social expectation or personal ambition. It was an ontological fact about who he was. Being Roman meant having obligations to Rome. Being a citizen meant participating in civic life. Being a senator meant working for the common good. These were not choices he made. They were necessities that flowed from his existence. But what did duty to the Republic mean in practical terms? This was the question that tormented Cato throughout his career. When the Republic's institutions were functioning properly, the answer was clear. Obey the laws, fulfill your offices with integrity, participate in the deliberative processes that made collective decisions. But what about when the institutions themselves became corrupt? What about when following the law meant participating in injustice? What about when the deliberative processes had been hijacked by demagogues and military strongmen? Cato's answer was that duty to the Republic meant defending its fundamental principles, even when those principles had been abandoned by everyone else. The Republic was not just a set of institutions or a particular constitutional arrangement. It was an idea, a commitment to collective self-governance under law, a belief that free citizens could manage their own affairs without submitting to a master. As long as Cato defended this idea, he was fulfilling his duty, regardless of whether he had any realistic hope of success. This understanding of duty led him to positions that appeared contradictory on the surface, but made perfect sense within his philosophical framework. He could violate specific laws, like the law against executing citizens without trial, while claiming to defend the Republic's fundamental principles. He could ally with men he considered immoral, like Pompey, while maintaining his own moral purity. He could use procedural tricks and obstruction tactics that seemed to subvert democratic processes, while insisting that he was defending democracy itself. His critics saw hypocrisy in these apparent contradictions. But Cato saw consistency. The Republic's soul was more important than its body. Its animating principles were more important than its temporary institutions. If you had to break a law to save the law, if you had to work with corrupt men to prevent total corruption, if you had to obstruct votes to preserve the voting system itself, then these actions were not just permissible, but obligatory. Duty sometimes required you to do things that looked like betrayals, but were actually the highest form of loyalty. This is a dangerous argument, of course. It is the argument that every authoritarian uses to justify their seizure of power. I am destroying democracy in order to save it. I am violating the Constitution in order to preserve constitutional government. I am becoming a dictator in order to prevent dictatorship. The difference between Cato and the authoritarians is that Cato never saw power for himself, never tried to benefit personally from his actions, never claimed that his violation of norms gave him the right to establish new norms in his own image. But this difference, while real, may not be enough to justify his methods. Because once you accept that defending principles is more important than following procedures, once you decide that you know what the Republic truly needs better than its actual citizens do, once you start breaking rules to preserve the system those rules were meant to protect, you have begun the slide toward tyranny even if you do not intend to. Cato never took that final step, but he came close enough that we can see how easily principled opposition can transform into unprincipled power. Cato's understanding of duty also shaped his approach to personal relationships. The Stoics taught that humans had different levels of obligation based on proximity and relationship. Your strongest duties were to your family, then to your friends, then to your fellow citizens, then to all humanity. But they also taught that these particular duties should not conflict with universal duties. If your family demanded that you do something unjust, your duty to universal reason trumped your duty to blood relations. Cato applied this principle rigorously. He would not show favoritism to family members in political appointments. He would not cover up the wrongdoing of friends. He would not place personal loyalty above what he judged to be the common good. This made him seem cold, even ruthless. There are stories of Cato refusing to help relatives who had gotten into legal trouble, even when that help would have been perfectly legal and socially expected. He did not do this because he hated his relatives or lacked natural affection. He did it because he believed that treating relatives differently from strangers based solely on blood relation was a form of favoritism that violated the Stoic principle of justice. This approach to relationships made Cato admirable, but not lovable. People respected his integrity but found him difficult to warm to. He inspired awe but not affection. He was the kind of person you would want in government, but might not want as a friend. Because friendship requires a degree of flexibility, a willingness to occasionally put affection above principle, to forgive weaknesses and overlook flaws. Cato could not do this. Or rather, he chose not to do it because doing it would have been a betrayal of his philosophical commitments. The question this raises is whether such rigorous adherence to duty is humanly sustainable. Can you live your entire life as if you were always on stage, always being judged, always required to choose principle over comfort? Most people cannot. Most people need spaces in their lives where they can relax their guard, be themselves without performance, act on impulse rather than calculation. Cato denied himself these spaces. He turned his entire life into a philosophical exercise, a continuous test of his commitment to Stoic principles. The psychological cost of this must have been enormous. Cato suffered from what we might now recognize as symptoms of chronic stress. He was reportedly prone to anger. He had digestive problems. He struggled with insomnia. These were not just personal difficulties. They were the physical manifestations of a life lived at maximum intensity, with no release, no rest, no permission to simply be human rather than philosophical. Yet Cato would have seen these sufferings as further tests of his virtue. The Stoics taught that the wise man remained undisturbed by physical discomfort, that bodily pain was an indifferent that could not touch the soul's tranquility. Whether Cato actually achieved this state of undisturbed acceptance, or whether he simply endured his suffering with gritted teeth and iron will, we cannot know. But we do know that he never allowed his personal difficulties to deflect him from what he judged to be his duty. This was both admirable and terrible. Admirable because it showed extraordinary strength of character. Terrible because it showed the price that such strength demanded. What does it mean to be free? This seems like a simple question with an obvious answer. You are free when you can do what you want without interference from others. But the Stoics understood that this definition of freedom is shallow and ultimately misleading. You can be free in this external sense, living in a democratic society, possessing wealth, having no master, and still be a slave to your passions, your fears, your unexamined beliefs. True freedom, the Stoics argued, is internal. It is the capacity to govern yourself according to reason, rather than being governed by irrational impulses and external circumstances. This was the freedom that Cato pursued with single-minded intensity. He wanted to be free, not in the sense that he could do whatever he pleased, but in the sense that nothing could force him to act against his rational judgment. Tyrants could threaten him, but they could not make him afraid. Mobs could attack him, but they could not make him pander to popular opinion. Fortune could take away his property, his position, even his life, but it could not take away his capacity to choose virtue in every circumstance. This understanding of freedom shaped every aspect of Cato's political philosophy. When he opposed Caesar, he was not primarily fighting to preserve Roman political institutions, though he did value those institutions. He was fighting to preserve the possibility of internal freedom, the space in which individuals could govern themselves rather than being governed by a master. Tyranny was not wrong simply because it concentrated power in one person, rather than distributing it among many. Tyranny was wrong because it reduced free citizens to slaves, because it destroyed the possibility of self-governance, because it treated rational beings as if they were animals to be managed, rather than moral agents responsible for their own choices. But here is where Cato's philosophy becomes troubling and reveals its limitations. If freedom is fundamentally internal, if the truly free person remains free even in chains, then why does external political freedom matter at all? If virtue is the only good, and virtue is always available regardless of circumstances, then why resist tyranny? Why not simply maintain your inner freedom while submitting to external control? The Stoics had an answer to this question, but it was not entirely satisfying. They argued that, while external freedom was an indifferent, it was a preferred indifferent. It was better to live in a free society than under a tyrant, better to have control over your external circumstances than to be subject to another's will. But this answer raises as many questions as it resolves. If external freedom is merely preferred rather than essential, then how much are you obligated to sacrifice to preserve it? How much suffering should you endure? How much risk should you take? At what point does the pursuit of a preferred indifferent become irrational? Cato never satisfactorily answered these questions, because his philosophical commitments and his political commitments were in tension with each other. As a Stoic, he should have been indifferent to external political arrangements, caring only about his own virtue. As a Roman, he was passionately committed to the Republic's survival and willing to sacrifice everything to preserve it. These two commitments could be reconciled philosophically. You could argue that defending the Republic was the virtuous thing to do regardless of outcome, but the reconciliation felt forced. It was clear that Cato cared deeply about the Republic's survival in a way that went beyond mere commitment to virtue. He loved Rome, and that love was an emotional reality that his philosophy struggled to accommodate. This tension between Stoic detachment and political passion revealed itself in Cato's rhetoric. When he spoke about Rome's decline, about the corruption of its institutions, about the threats posed by ambitious generals, he did not sound like a philosopher serenely accepting the indifference of external circumstances. He sounded like a man watching something precious being destroyed and desperately trying to stop it. His speeches were not calm expositions of Stoic principles, but passionate denunciations of vice and urgent warnings about Rome's future. This passion was both Cato's strength and his weakness. It made him an effective political speaker, someone who could move audiences and inspire commitment. But it also made him vulnerable. If you truly did not care about outcomes, if you were genuinely indifferent to whether the Republic survived or fell, then defeat could not touch you. But Cato did care. And when defeat came, as it inevitably did, it devastated him in ways that pure Stoic philosophy could not heal. The paradox of Cato's concept of freedom is that his very commitment to internal freedom led him to sacrifice it. By making himself into an absolute opponent of tyranny, by staking everything on the Republic's survival, by identifying his own virtue with resistance to Caesar, he made himself dependent on external circumstances in precisely the way that Stoicism was supposed to prevent. He became a slave to his own cause, unable to be happy unless the Republic survived, unable to be at peace unless Caesar was defeated. This is the tragedy of all principled political action. The moment you commit yourself to a cause, you make yourself vulnerable to that cause's failure. The moment you stake your identity on resistance to injustice, you give that injustice power over your inner peace. The moment you say, "This is what I stand for and I will never compromise," you have created conditions under which your defeat becomes not just a practical failure, but an existential crisis. Cato discovered this truth in the most painful way possible. His entire life had been organized around defending Republican freedom. When that freedom was destroyed, when Caesar's victory became inevitable, when the cause to which Cato had devoted himself was revealed as hopeless, what remained? What did Stoic freedom mean when the external structures that made such freedom meaningful had collapsed? These were the questions that would drive Cato toward his final, terrible choice. In a corrupt political system, what is the role of virtue? This question has haunted political philosophy since Plato, and Cato's career provides one of history's most vivid case studies in the impossibility of answering it satisfactorily. On one hand, if you compromise your virtue to succeed in a corrupt system, you become part of that corruption and lose your moral authority. On the other hand, if you maintain absolute virtue and refuse all compromise, you become politically irrelevant and lose your practical effectiveness. Cato chose virtue and irrelevance. Was he right? Cato's approach to politics was based on a theory of moral leadership. He believed that if men of virtue would stand firm in their principles, refuse to be corrupted, and model the behavior they wished to see, others would follow their example. The Republic's problems stem from a failure of moral leadership. Too many senators cared more about their private interests than the public good. Too many put popularity before principle. Too many were willing to excuse wrongdoing if it served their political faction. If this pattern could be reversed, if virtue could be modeled at the highest levels of government, then Rome could be saved. This theory was not entirely wrong. Moral leadership matters. Example is powerful. When people see others making sacrifices for principle, it can inspire them to do the same. Cato did influence some of his contemporaries to behave better than they otherwise would have. Young men entering politics saw in Cato a model of what Roman virtue looked like, and some tried to emulate it. Even his enemies were constrained by his presence, forced to at least pretend to care about traditional values, because Cato's very existence reminded everyone what those values were. But moral leadership has strict limits, especially in a fundamentally corrupt system. For Cato's strategy to work, enough people had to care about virtue that his example would catalyze a moral renewal. But what if most people did not care? What if they were content with corruption because corruption served their interests? What if they viewed Cato's virtue not as an inspiration, but as a rebuke, something that made them uncomfortable and that they wanted to eliminate? This was the reality Cato faced. Most Romans were not inspired by his example. They were annoyed by it. He made them feel bad about themselves without offering them a path to improvement that they were willing to take. Because the path Cato offered required genuine sacrifice of wealth, of ambition, of the pleasures that came from participating in a corrupt but successful system. Very few people are willing to make such sacrifices, especially when the reward is not personal benefit, but abstract commitment to principle. Cato's political methods reflected his commitment to virtue over effectiveness. He refused to use the normal tools of Roman politics: bribery, favoritism, backroom deals, strategic alliances with unsavory characters. He insisted on doing everything openly, according to law and precedent, with scrupulous attention to procedure. This made him predictable, easy to outmaneuver, and ultimately ineffective. Caesar, by contrast, was a master of the corrupt system. He understood that politics was about building coalitions, accumulating debts that could be called in later, knowing when to compromise and when to stand firm. He was willing to break rules when following them would disadvantage him. He could make promises he did not intend to keep, flatter people he despised, and switch positions when circumstances demanded. All the things that made Cato recoil with disgust were tools that Caesar wielded with virtuoso skill. The result was that Caesar achieved his objectives while Cato did not. Caesar became dictator and transformed Rome according to his vision. Cato died in defeat, having failed to preserve the republic he loved. If we judge politics by results, Caesar won and Cato lost. But should we judge politics solely by results, Cato would have said no. The Stoics taught that virtue was the only true success, that external outcomes were indifferent. If you acted virtuously and failed, you were more successful than someone who acted viciously and succeeded. This is a beautiful philosophy, but it is also a philosophy that justifies failure, that allows you to feel good about accomplishing nothing as long as you maintained your principles. The question is whether there is a middle ground between Cato's uncompromising virtue and Caesar's immoral pragmatism. Can you maintain ethical standards while still being politically effective? Can you compromise on tactics while remaining firm on principles? Can you work within a corrupt system while not becoming corrupted by it? Cicero tried to find this middle ground. He was a committed Republican who shared many of Cato's values, but he was also a pragmatist who understood the need for flexibility and compromise. He tried to build coalitions, negotiate with different factions, and preserve Republican institutions through careful political maneuvering. And he failed just as completely as Cato did, though in a different way. Caesar ignored him, viewed him as irrelevant, And eventually, Cicero was murdered during the proscriptions that followed Caesar's assassination. The lesson seems to be that in a truly corrupt system, one that has passed the point of no return, no political strategy works. Neither uncompromising virtue nor pragmatic flexibility can save institutions that are already dead. The only question is how you want to fail, with your principles intact, but having accomplished nothing, or with some practical achievements bought at the cost of moral compromise. Cato chose the first kind of failure. He went down fighting, never betraying his principles, maintaining his integrity to the end. This made him a hero to later generations who valued his witness to virtue in an age of vice. But it also made him irrelevant to his own time, unable to prevent the very outcome he most feared. After Caesar's victory at Pharsalus, rational strategy dictated surrender. The Republican cause was militarily hopeless. Pompey was dead. Most of the Republican forces had been destroyed or defected. Caesar was offering generous terms to those who submitted. Any reasonable person would have recognized that continuing the resistance was pointless. But Cato was not reasonable in this sense. He fled to North Africa with the remnants of the Republican army and established a base at Utica. From there, he continued to organize resistance, gathering forces, making alliances with local rulers, preparing for a final confrontation with Caesar. He knew this was hopeless. Everyone knew it was hopeless. But Cato was operating according to a logic that transcended practical considerations. The Stoics taught that you should fulfill your duties regardless of outcome. Your obligation was to act virtuously, not to succeed. If defending the Republic was virtuous, then you should defend it even when defense was hopeless. To surrender simply because victory was impossible would be to admit that virtue was subordinate to pragmatism, that principles only mattered when following them was convenient. Cato could not accept this, so he fought on, not because he thought he could win, but because fighting was what virtue required. This was not madness, though it might have looked like madness to his contemporaries. It was the logical conclusion of Cato's Stoic principles applied to an impossible situation. He was demonstrating that virtue did not depend on circumstances, that a free man could choose his actions even when all choices led to defeat. This was the ultimate expression of Stoic freedom, to continue acting according to reason even when reason told you that your actions would fail. The psychological state required to maintain this position must have been extraordinary. Imagine knowing with certainty that everything you are fighting for is already lost, that your cause is doomed, that your resistance will accomplish nothing except to delay the inevitable. And yet continuing to fight anyway, day after day, making plans, giving orders, acting as if victory were possible when you know it is not. This requires a form of mental discipline that borders on the superhuman. Or perhaps it requires a form of self-deception. Perhaps Cato could continue fighting only by not fully acknowledging to himself that the cause was hopeless. Perhaps he maintained some small irrational hope that circumstances would change, that Caesar would make a mistake, that the gods would intervene. We cannot know what was going on in Cato's mind during these final months. But we do know that he maintained the appearance of confidence and determination, continuing to function as the leader of the Republican resistance, even as that resistance crumbled around him. The end came in 46 BCE. Caesar landed in Africa with his legions and began systematically crushing the remaining Republican forces. One by one, the Republican strongholds fell. Cato's allies deserted or surrendered. The military situation became untenable. Caesar was closing in on Utica, and everyone knew what this meant. The end of resistance, the final victory of tyranny over freedom, the death of the Roman Republic. Cato could have fled. He could have escaped to some distant province and lived out his days in exile. He could have surrendered to Caesar and accepted pardon like so many others had done. Caesar would have welcomed this. He admired Cato, respected his integrity, and would have been happy to have such a famous opponent publicly submit to his authority. Cato's surrender would have been the perfect symbol of Caesar's complete victory. This was precisely why Cato could not surrender. To submit to Caesar would be to acknowledge Caesar's right to grant pardon, to accept the role of subject before a master, to admit that power trumped principle. It would be to participate in the destruction of the very thing he had spent his entire life defending, the idea that free citizens should govern themselves rather than being governed by a king. So Cato made a different choice, the only choice that remained consistent with his principles and his understanding of freedom. He decided to die. Not as a victim of Caesar's victory, but as an agent of his own fate, not in surrender but in defiance, not as proof of Caesar's power, but as proof that Caesar's power had limits. Caesar could conquer the world, but he could not make Cato submit. There was one final space of freedom that tyranny could not touch, the freedom to choose death over dishonor. On his last night, Cato dined with friends and engaged in philosophical discussion. The topic was Stoic paradoxes, particularly the question of whether only the wise man is free. This was not morbid or theatrical. This was Cato doing what he had always done, using philosophy to understand his situation and determine the right course of action. The question of freedom had become urgent and personal. In a world conquered by Caesar, could anyone still be free? And if so, what form did that freedom take? After dinner, Cato retired to his room with Plato's Phaedo, the dialogue in which Socrates discusses the immortality of the soul on the night before his execution. This choice of reading material was significant. Socrates faced a situation similar to Cato's. He could have escaped death through exile or by compromising his principles, but he chose to die rather than betray what he believed to be right. The Phaedo explores why this choice makes sense, arguing that death is not an evil for the philosopher because it liberates the soul from the body's constraints. Cato read the dialogue twice, underlining passages, making notes. He was not simply passing time before death. He was preparing himself philosophically, using Plato's arguments to strengthen his resolve and clarify his understanding of what he was about to do. This is what it means to truly live by philosophy, to use it not as abstract theory, but as a practical guide when facing life's ultimate questions. When everyone else had gone to sleep, Cato attempted to kill himself with his sword. He stabbed himself in the stomach, the traditional Roman method of suicide that was considered honorable when chosen freely. But his hand was weak. He had injured it earlier in a fit of rage, and the wound, though serious, was not immediately fatal. He fell to the floor, and the sound brought his servants running. They found him covered in blood, his intestines protruding from the wound. They called for a doctor, who stitched up the wound and believed he could save Cato's life. But when Cato regained consciousness and realized what had happened, he was furious. He had made his choice, and it was being taken from him. He waited until the doctor and servants left the room, then tore open the stitches and pulled out his own intestines, completing the work he had begun. This was not the peaceful philosophical death that the Phaedo describes. This was brutal, painful, and horrible. Cato died slowly, in agony, having literally torn himself apart, rather than allow anyone to save him. The manner of his death was as uncompromising as his life had been. He would do it himself in his own way, accepting no help, showing no weakness, maintaining control over the one thing that remained in his power, the moment and method of his death. When news of Cato's death reached Caesar, his response was complex and revealing. He reportedly said, "Cato, I grudge you your death, as you would have grudged me the clemency I would have shown you." This was not the statement of a simple tyrant celebrating the death of an enemy. This was a man who understood exactly what Cato had done and why it was so devastating to his own project. Caesar wanted to pardon Cato. He wanted to demonstrate his clemency, his magnanimity, his superiority to petty revenge. He wanted to show that he was not a tyrant, but a statesman who could rise above partisan hatred. Cato's surrender and acceptance of pardon would have validated Caesar's entire approach to power. That strong leadership combined with mercy was better than the chaos of Republican faction fighting. But Cato denied him this satisfaction. By choosing death over pardon, Cato demonstrated that Caesar's power was not complete, that there were Romans who would rather die than submit to autocratic rule, that the Republic's spirit lived on even after its institutions had been destroyed. Cato's death was his final political act, his last service to the Republic he loved. It was a statement that would echo through Roman history and beyond. Tyranny can kill the free, but it cannot make them unfree. The Stoic philosophy that shaped Cato's life also shaped his death. The Stoics believed that suicide was permissible when circumstances made it impossible to live according to virtue. If continuing to live required you to compromise your principles, if external conditions prevented you from fulfilling your duties as a rational being, then choosing death was not only acceptable but could be the wise choice. The wise man knew when to exit life, just as he knew when to exit a party, when staying longer would be inappropriate or undignified. But Cato's suicide was not simply a personal choice based on individual circumstances. It was a political act with political meaning. By refusing to live in Caesar's Rome, Cato was making a statement about what kind of life was worth living. He was saying that life under tyranny was not true life, that survival without freedom was not really survival, that existing as Caesar's subject was worse than not existing at all. This was an extreme position, and not all Stoics would have agreed with it. Later, Stoics like Seneca and Marcus Aurelius would argue that you could maintain your inner freedom even under tyrannical rule, that the wise man could serve even a bad emperor while maintaining his integrity. But Cato took a harder line. For him, there was a point beyond which accommodation became complicity, where continuing to participate in the system meant betraying everything that made participation meaningful. Was he right? This question has no easy answer. On one hand, his suicide accomplished nothing practical. Caesar's victory was complete. The Republic died with or without Cato. His death did not slow Caesar's consolidation of power or inspire any immediate resistance. On the other hand, his death created a symbol that would inspire resistance to tyranny for centuries. Every generation facing autocratic rule would remember Cato and be reminded that submission is not inevitable, that death can be chosen freely, that the human spirit has resources that power cannot touch. Cato's death marked the end of the Roman Republic, but it was also the beginning of Cato's transformation into something more than a man. He became a symbol, an idea, a rallying point for everyone who wanted to believe that virtue still mattered in a world governed by power. The historical Cato, with all his complexity and contradictions, gradually disappeared behind the legend of Cato, the perfect Stoic, Cato the unbending Republican, Cato the last free Roman. This transformation began immediately. Even Caesar, who had won everything, could not escape Cato's shadow. He felt compelled to write a pamphlet attacking Cato's memory, trying to diminish his reputation by pointing to his flaws and contradictions. This was a mistake. By attacking a dead man who had killed himself rather than submit, Caesar made himself look petty and vindictive. He gave Cato's supporters ammunition and confirmed that Cato's death had wounded him more than any military defeat could have. The assassins who killed Caesar 4 years later claimed to be acting in Cato's name, restoring the republic that Cato had died defending. They called themselves liberators. But they were really Cato's spiritual heirs, men who had absorbed his lesson that tyranny must be resisted at all costs. Of course, their assassination did not restore the Republic. It plunged Rome into another round of civil wars that would eventually result in Augustus's establishment of a permanent autocracy. The Republic was dead, and no amount of assassinations could resurrect it. But the conspirators did not know this. They believed, as Cato had believed, that one virtuous act could change everything. In the centuries that followed, Cato became the standard against which Roman virtue was measured. Seneca the Younger, writing during the reign of Nero, held up Cato as the model of the Stoic sage. Lucan, in his epic poem about the Civil War, portrayed Cato as the moral center of the narrative, the one character who remained pure while everyone else was corrupted by the struggle for power. When Romans wanted to criticize the empire's moral decay, they pointed to Cato and asked, "Where are such men today?" But this idealization of Cato was also a form of falsification. The real Cato was not a plaster saint. He was difficult, inflexible, sometimes cruel in his judgments. He made political mistakes that contributed to the very outcome he was trying to prevent. His absolute refusal to compromise may have made him morally admirable, but it also made him politically ineffective. A more nuanced assessment would acknowledge both his virtues and his limitations. Yet perhaps this nuanced assessment misses the point. Cato did not want to be judged by the normal standards of political success. He did not care whether his actions were pragmatic or strategically sound. He cared only whether they were virtuous, and by his own standards, he succeeded absolutely. He maintained his integrity to the end. He never compromised his principles. He chose death over dishonor. What more could be asked of him? The question is whether this kind of success is meaningful. Is it enough to be virtuous if your virtue accomplishes nothing? Is it enough to witness against injustice if your witness does not prevent the injustice from occurring? Is it enough to die for your principles if your death does not save what you were trying to protect? Cato would have said yes. The Stoics taught that virtue is its own reward, that the good life consists in acting according to reason, regardless of consequences. But this teaching, while philosophically sophisticated, fails to address the political and human dimensions of Cato's situation. His choice was not just about his personal virtue. It was about what kind of world he was willing to live in and what kind of example he wanted to set for others. In this larger sense, perhaps Cato's witness did accomplish something. He demonstrated that even in the worst circumstances, even when all hope is lost, even when power seems absolute, the human capacity for moral choice remains. Tyranny can control your body, your property, your external circumstances, but it cannot control your will unless you allow it to. This is a truth that every generation living under oppression needs to rediscover, and Cato's example provides one way of discovering it. Cato's career exposes a fundamental tension within Stoic philosophy, the relationship between the individual pursuit of virtue and the collective management of political life. Stoicism began as a philosophy of personal ethics, a guide for how the individual should live. But when Stoics became involved in politics, as many did, they faced questions that their philosophy was not fully equipped to answer. The core Stoic teaching is that virtue is the only good, and that the virtuous life consists in living according to nature and reason. External circumstances, wealth, health, reputation, political power are indifferents that cannot affect your fundamental well-being. This teaching is liberating on an individual level. It frees you from anxiety about things outside your control and focuses your attention on the one thing that is within your control, your own choices and character. But what happens when you apply this individualistic framework to politics? Politics is fundamentally about managing external circumstances, distributing resources, organizing social institutions, making collective decisions. If these external matters are truly indifferent, then why should the virtuous person care about them? Why not withdraw from politics entirely and focus on perfecting your own character? The Stoics had an answer to this question, but it was not entirely satisfying. They argued that humans are naturally social beings with obligations to their communities. Even though political outcomes are indifferent, working for the common good is itself virtuous. Therefore, the wise man should participate in politics, not because he cares about success or failure, but because political participation is appropriate to human nature and thus virtuous. Cato tried to live by this principle, but the tension kept erupting. He clearly did care about political outcomes. He was not serenely indifferent to whether the Republic survived or fell. His passionate opposition to Caesar, his willingness to die rather than live under autocracy, his evident anguish at Rome's decline, all of this shows that he had not achieved the Stoic ideal of being truly indifferent to external circumstances. This was not a personal failure on Cato's part. It was a philosophical problem with Stoicism itself. The theory says that externals are indifferent, but human psychology is not built to be indifferent to things like freedom, justice, and the survival of our communities. We cannot help but care about these things, and perhaps we should not try to stop caring. Perhaps caring about more than just our own virtue is what makes us fully human. Some later Stoics tried to resolve this tension by distinguishing between different types of indifference. Some indifference are preferred, while others are dispreferred. You should work to obtain preferred indifference like freedom and justice, even though they cannot ultimately affect your happiness. But this distinction raises more questions than it answers. How hard should you work to obtain preferred indifference? How much should you sacrifice? At what point does the pursuit of preferred indifference become an irrational attachment that threatens your inner freedom? Cato struggled with these questions throughout his career. He knew that Stoic theory said he should be indifferent to political outcomes, but he could not make himself feel that indifference. He cared desperately about Rome's survival. This caring drove him to extraordinary efforts and ultimately to his death. Was this consistent with Stoicism? Opinions differ, but the very fact that the question arises shows the philosophical tension. Another problem with applying Stoicism to politics concerns the question of compromise. Stoic ethics is absolutist. Virtue is virtue. Vice is vice. There is no middle ground. But politics is the art of compromise, of achieving the possible rather than demanding the ideal, of working with imperfect people and institutions to produce marginally better outcomes. Cato tried to bring Stoic absolutism into political life, and it made him ineffective. He could not make strategic alliances with people he considered corrupt. He could not support legislation that was imperfect, but better than the alternative. He could not make the kinds of deals and compromises that are necessary for getting things done in any political system. His rigidity, which was virtuous from a Stoic perspective, was disastrous from a political perspective. The question is whether this was a flaw in Cato's application of Stoicism or a flaw in Stoicism itself as a political philosophy. Perhaps there is no way to be both a good Stoic and an effective politician. Perhaps the demands of politics, compromise, flexibility, pragmatism are fundamentally incompatible with the demands of Stoic virtue. If so, then the Stoic who enters politics faces an impossible choice: betray your philosophy or fail politically. Cato chose to maintain his philosophy and accept political failure. Other Stoics made different choices. Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic emperor, compromised constantly because he had to make the Roman Empire function. He did things that a rigorist like Cato would have condemned, making expedient alliances, tolerating corruption when he lacked the power to eliminate it, choosing pragmatic solutions over ideal ones. But he remained a Stoic, or at least he tried to be one, adjusting his philosophy to accommodate political realities. Which approach is correct? This is not a question that can be answered definitively because it depends on what you value more, philosophical purity or political effectiveness. Cato valued purity and got ineffectiveness. Marcus Aurelius valued effectiveness and had to compromise purity. Perhaps there is no third option. Perhaps you must choose what kind of failure you prefer. Central to Stoic philosophy is the idea that virtue is knowledge. If you truly understand what is good, if you see clearly how reality is structured, if you grasp the nature of the human soul and its relationship to the cosmic order, then you will automatically act virtuously. Vice stems from ignorance, from false beliefs about what matters, from cognitive errors about the nature of reality. This meant that Stoic philosophy placed enormous emphasis on education. Not education in the modern sense of accumulating information, but education as the transformation of the soul, the restructuring of your understanding, the replacement of false beliefs with true ones. The Stoics developed elaborate training programs designed to accomplish this transformation. These were not merely intellectual exercises, but psychological practices aimed at changing how you perceive and respond to the world. Cato underwent this education from a young age, and it shaped every aspect of his character. The Stoic training he received taught him to analyze his emotional reactions, to question his instinctive responses, to ask whether his desires were based on true understanding or on false beliefs inherited from culture and convention. It taught him to practice negative visualization, imagining the loss of everything he valued so that he would not become overly attached to externals. It taught him to view death not as an evil, but as a natural event, no more frightening than falling asleep. But Stoic education was not just about intellectual understanding. It required practice, habituation, the gradual development of new instincts and reactions. The Stoics used what we might now call cognitive behavioral techniques, catching yourself when you fall into irrational patterns of thinking, consciously reframing situations to see them more clearly, deliberately, cultivating emotional responses that align with reason rather than with passion. Cato practiced these techniques throughout his life with extraordinary discipline. When he felt anger rising, he would pause and ask himself whether his anger was rational. When he faced hardship, he would remind himself that external circumstances were indifference. When he was tempted by pleasure, he would consider whether indulging that pleasure was consistent with virtue. He turned his entire life into a training program for developing the Stoic ideal of wisdom. This constant self-monitoring and self-correction created a particular quality of consciousness that we can detect in the historical accounts of Cato's life. He was intensely self-aware, always observing his own thoughts and actions, never simply reacting without reflection. This self-awareness was the foundation of his freedom. Because he could observe his own mental processes, he was not enslaved by them. Because he could examine his beliefs, he was not controlled by false ones. But this level of self-awareness also came with costs. It made spontaneity difficult. It created a gap between experience and the experience of experiencing, a layer of reflexivity that prevented immediate engagement with life. Cato could never simply feel or act without analyzing whether his feelings and actions were virtuous. This made him effective as a moral agent, but perhaps less effective as a human being. The Stoics believed that this self-consciousness was a form of enlightenment, that the examined life was superior to the unreflective life. But we might question whether constant self-examination is really the highest human achievement. Perhaps there is value in moments when you forget yourself, when you act without calculation, when you experience life directly, rather than through the filter of philosophical analysis. Cato rarely allowed himself such moments, His entire existence was mediated by his Stoic training. Every action was evaluated, every emotion examined, every thought subjected to rational scrutiny. This created a kind of psychological invulnerability. Nothing could surprise him. Nothing could overwhelm him. Nothing could make him lose his philosophical composure. But it also created a kind of rigidity, a lack of flexibility and spontaneity that made him difficult to relate to, and perhaps difficult to be. The question this raises is whether Stoic education produces better human beings or merely different ones. Does training yourself to be emotionally detached make you wiser, or does it just make you cold? Does learning to view everything as indifferent give you freedom, or does it take away your capacity to care deeply about anything? Does constant self-examination lead to greater self-knowledge, or does it create an artificial separation between the observing self and the observed self? These are questions that cannot be answered in the abstract. Different people will experience Stoic training differently. For Cato, it provided a framework that organized his entire life and gave him the strength to resist pressures that would have crushed most people. But it also trapped him in patterns of rigidity that contributed to his political failures and his personal isolation. Whether the benefits outweighed the costs is something each person must judge for themselves. One of the most troubling aspects of Cato's career is his willingness to use violence in defense of the Republic. This seems to contradict Stoic principles, which emphasize reason, self-control, and the recognition that all human beings share in the divine logos and therefore deserve respect. How could Cato, who was supposed to embody Stoic virtue, support the execution of the Catiline conspirators without trial? How could he advocate for harsh measures against political opponents? How could he justify violence in the name of preserving republican institutions? The answer lies in understanding how Cato thought about justice and social order. For the Stoics, justice was not merely about treating individuals fairly. It was about maintaining the cosmic order, ensuring that each thing occupied its proper place in the rational structure of reality. Political disorder for Cato was not just an inconvenience or even just an injustice. It was a violation of natural law, a disruption of the rational order that should govern human affairs. From this perspective, violence used to restore order and uphold law was not the same as violence used for personal gain or out of uncontrolled passion. It was rational violence, measured violence, violence in service of a higher purpose. When Cato supported the execution of the conspirators, he was not acting out of hatred or fear. He was making a calculated judgment that the Republic's survival required decisive action against those who threatened it. But this distinction between rational and irrational violence is far more complex than Cato seemed to recognize. Who decides what constitutes a genuine threat to the Republic? Who determines when violence is necessary rather than merely convenient? Who draws the line between defensive force and tyrannical oppression? Cato assumed that these questions had clear answers, that any reasonable person could see when violence was justified. But history shows that such clarity is rare. More often, people convince themselves that their violence is rational and necessary when it is really driven by fear, anger, or the desire for power. Cato's own violence was relatively restrained compared to what would come later. He supported executions, not mass murder. He advocated for harsh measures against specific threats, not indiscriminate repression. He genuinely believed that the violence he supported was minimal force necessary to preserve republican institutions. But he set a precedent that others would use to justify far worse. Once you accept that the Republic's survival justifies breaking normal legal constraints, once you decide that emergency circumstances override ordinary rights, once you embrace the logic of necessity knows no law, you have opened a door that is very difficult to close. This is the paradox of principled violence. Cato wanted to save Republican liberty, but the methods he used to save it eroded the very liberties he was trying to preserve. He wanted to maintain the rule of law, but he supported extra-legal executions when he judged the situation desperate enough. He wanted to prevent tyranny, but he was willing to use tyrannical methods if he believed they served anti-tyrannical purposes. The Stoics had theoretical resources for thinking about this problem, but those resources were not adequate to resolve it. They distinguished between actions that were genuinely virtuous and actions that were merely appropriate, given the circumstances. They recognized that the wise man might have to do things in imperfect situations that he would not do in ideal circumstances. But these distinctions did not provide clear guidance about when and how violence could be used consistent with virtue. Cato tried to navigate these difficult questions with integrity. He did not use violence for personal benefit. He did not seek to harm his enemies out of spite. He tried to limit violence to what was necessary for Republican defense. But necessary is a slippery concept, especially when you are the one making the judgment about necessity. And Republican defense can be expansively interpreted to justify almost any action that serves your political faction. The deeper problem is that violence has a logic of its own that tends to escape the control of those who initiate it. Cato supported the execution of the conspirators, believing this would strengthen the Republic, but it set a precedent for using emergency measures that would eventually be turned against the Republic itself. The willingness to break normal legal constraints, even for good reasons, makes it easier for others to break those constraints for bad reasons. Violence justified as defense can become violence used for offense. Emergency measures meant to be temporary can become permanent. This is the tragedy of trying to defend liberty through illiberal means. You cannot preserve freedom by destroying freedom. You cannot uphold law by violating law. You cannot prevent tyranny by using tyrannical methods. Or rather, you can try to do these things, but you will discover that the means corrupt the ends, that the methods you use transform the goals you are pursuing, that fighting monsters risks turning you into a monster. Cato never became a monster. His violence remained relatively limited, his methods relatively restrained, his motives relatively pure. But he contributed to a political culture in which violence became an acceptable tool for resolving political disputes, in which emergency reasoning justified the suspension of normal rights, in which the Republic's defense required the compromise of Republican principles. This was not what he intended, but it was part of the logic he helped establish. To be virtuous in a corrupt world is to be alone. This was perhaps the deepest truth that Cato discovered through his lived experience. When everyone around you has accepted corruption as normal, when your society has collectively decided that principles do not matter as much as success, when the very idea of putting virtue above advantage seems naive and impractical, maintaining your integrity isolates you from your community. Cato felt this isolation acutely. He could not participate in the normal social networks that held Roman elite society together, because participating would require compromises he could not make. He could not build the kinds of political alliances that successful Romans built, because those alliances required trading favors and tolerating corruption. He could not engage in the casual social interactions that create friendship and trust, because he could not pretend to approve of things he actually condemned. This was not mere social awkwardness, it was existential isolation. Cato lived by a code that almost no one else accepted, valued things that almost no one else valued, believed in principles that almost no one else took seriously. He was, in effect, a foreigner in his own society, speaking a language that his contemporaries had forgotten, following customs that they had abandoned, worshipping at altars they had desecrated. The psychological cost of this isolation must have been enormous. Humans are social beings who need connection, validation, and belonging. We need to feel that we are part of a community, that others understand and appreciate us, that our lives have meaning in a shared context. Cato denied himself all of this by refusing to compromise his principles. He chose virtue over belonging, integrity over acceptance, principle over connection. This choice created a particular kind of personality. Cato became hard, rigid, unwilling to show vulnerability or need. He could not admit weakness because doing so would suggest that his sacrifices had been for nothing. He could not express doubt because his entire identity was built on certainty. He could not laugh at himself because laughter requires a kind of self-distance that his philosophical commitments did not permit. He became, in short, inhuman. Or rather, he became a particular kind of human, one who has developed certain capacities to an extraordinary degree while atrophying others. Yet despite this isolation, or perhaps because of it, Cato commanded respect. Even people who disliked him, even people who were annoyed by his inflexibility, recognized that he was genuine in a way that almost no one else was. In a world of performers, he was authentic. In a city of liars, he spoke truth. In an age of corruption, he maintained integrity. This made him valuable in a strange way, even to those who did not want to emulate him. Cato became a kind of moral reference point, a standard against which others measured themselves even if they failed to meet that standard. People knew that if they wanted to know what virtue required in any situation, they could ask Cato, and he would tell them, regardless of whether that answer was convenient or popular. He was the conscience of Rome, and like all consciences, he was both necessary and unwanted. This role, being the moral conscience of a corrupt society, is perhaps the loneliest position imaginable. A moral conscience cannot have friends in the normal sense because friendship requires a degree of moral equality. You cannot be friends with someone who is always judging you, always finding you wanting, always reminding you of how far you fall short of your own stated ideals. You can respect such a person, even admire them, but you cannot relax around them, cannot be yourself, cannot enjoy their company without feeling inadequate. Cato had allies and associates, but it is not clear that he had friends. His relationships were defined by shared political commitments rather than by personal affection. He worked with people toward common goals, but he did not seem to open himself to them emotionally. Perhaps he could not afford to. Perhaps maintaining his rigorous adherence to principle required a kind of emotional distance that made friendship impossible. The question this raises is whether virtue at this level is compatible with human flourishing. The Stoics said yes. They defined flourishing entirely in terms of virtue, so the virtuous person was by definition flourishing. But this seems like a philosophical sleight of hand. When we talk about human flourishing in ordinary language, we mean something more than just virtue. We mean relationships, connection, joy, spontaneity, the full range of human experience and emotion. By these ordinary standards, Cato did not flourish. He was miserable, isolated, constantly frustrated by his inability to prevent the things he most feared. He died in defeat, having failed to save the republic he loved. His virtue did not bring him happiness, did not create meaningful relationships, did not allow him to enjoy life. It gave him integrity, but at the cost of almost everything else that makes life worth living. Was this worth it? Cato would have said yes without hesitation. He valued virtue above all else, and he achieved virtue. But we might wonder whether a philosophy that requires such total sacrifice is a philosophy for human beings, or only for philosophical ideals. Can we really recommend Cato's path to others? Can we really say that this is how people should live? Or must we admit that Cato's life, while admirable in its way, represents an extreme that few people could sustain, and that perhaps few should even attempt? Was Cato a failure? By any practical measure, yes. He tried to save the Roman Republic, and the Republic fell. He tried to stop Caesar, and Caesar won. He tried to maintain traditional Roman virtue, and Rome became an empire built on autocratic power. He spent his entire political career fighting against trends that ultimately prevailed despite his efforts. He died in defeat, having accomplished virtually none of his political objectives. But the question of success and failure cannot be answered purely in practical terms. Cato was not trying to succeed in the way that politicians normally try to succeed. He was not seeking power, wealth, or fame for himself. He was trying to witness to certain values, to model a certain kind of life, to demonstrate that virtue was possible even in the most corrupt circumstances. Judged by these standards, did he fail? The answer depends on what you think witnessing accomplishes. If you believe that moral witness is meaningless unless it produces practical results, then Cato's life was pointless. He might as well have withdrawn from politics entirely and focused on his own philosophical development. His political engagement accomplished nothing except to make himself miserable and to provide entertainment for those who enjoyed watching him futilely oppose the inevitable. But if you believe that moral witness has value independent of its practical effects, that demonstrating the possibility of virtue is itself important, that modeling a different way of life matters even if most people do not follow that model, then Cato's life was not a failure. He showed that it was possible to remain uncorrupted in a corrupt system, that integrity could be maintained even when it cost you everything, that there were values worth dying for, even if dying for them did not save those values. This is a fundamentally different understanding of success. It judges actions by their moral quality rather than by their consequences. It values being right over winning. It cares more about maintaining your principles than about achieving your objectives. This is the Stoic view, and it is the view that Cato embodied in his life and death. But we should acknowledge the problems with this view. First, it can be used to justify complete ineffectiveness. If all that matters is maintaining your virtue, then you have no responsibility to actually improve the world, or prevent suffering, or protect the innocent. You can remain pure while everything burns around you, comforting yourself with the thought that at least you did not compromise your principles. This can become a form of moral narcissism, caring more about your own integrity than about the effects of your actions. Second, this view can lead to a troubling indifference about means. If outcomes do not matter, then you do not need to think carefully about strategy, tactics, or the most effective ways to achieve your goals. You can engage in symbolic gestures that make you feel virtuous but accomplish nothing. You can pursue policies that make you feel good about yourself, but actually make the situation worse. Purity of intention becomes an excuse for not thinking clearly about consequences. Third, and perhaps most importantly, this view can abandon those who need practical help in favor of abstract principle. If you care only about maintaining your virtue and not about whether your actions actually help people, then you have lost sight of what virtue is supposed to be for. Virtue is not just an abstract quality that makes you admirable. It is supposed to guide you toward actions that benefit yourself and others. A virtue that produces only failure and suffering is questionable as virtue. Cato would have rejected all of these criticisms. He would have argued that practical success built on vicious means is not real success, that compromising your principles to achieve objectives corrupts both you and your objectives, that sometimes witnessing to truth is the only moral option even when that witness accomplishes nothing. And there is something to these arguments. We can imagine situations where maintaining integrity is more important than achieving practical results, where losing with honor is better than winning with dishonor. But we should also recognize that these situations are rarer than Cato seemed to think. In most political circumstances, there are ways to achieve good outcomes without completely abandoning your principles. There are compromises that do not amount to corruption. There are alliances with imperfect people that do not make you complicit in their imperfections. There are strategies that balance moral concerns with practical effectiveness. Cato's tragedy was that he could not make these kinds of distinctions. For him, everything was binary, virtue or vice, republic or tyranny, principle or compromise. This absolutism made him admirable as a moral exemplar, but ineffective as a politician. It is possible to be both virtuous and effective, but it requires a flexibility that Cato did not possess, and that his Stoic philosophy did not adequately encourage. The final assessment of Cato's life must therefore be mixed. He achieved a kind of moral success. He remained true to his principles to the end, but at enormous cost. He preserved his integrity, but failed to preserve the Republic. He modeled virtue, but did not inspire enough others to follow his model. He demonstrated that resistance was possible, but did not make resistance effective. He became a symbol, but could not change reality. Perhaps this is the best that can be hoped for in a truly corrupt system. Perhaps symbolic witness is the only form of success available when practical success is impossible. Perhaps Cato's life represents not failure, but the limits of what individual virtue can accomplish when the structures of society have already collapsed. His story reminds us that there are some situations where all options are tragic, where every choice leads to loss, where the only question is what kind of loss you are willing to accept. What can Cato teach us today? This question is urgent, because we live in a time that resembles Cato's in troubling ways. Western democracies face challenges to their fundamental institutions. Norms that seemed permanent are eroding. Leaders flout rules that previous generations considered sacrosanct. Political polarization makes compromise increasingly difficult. The gap between rich and poor widens. Traditional sources of meaning and social cohesion weaken. The parallels to the late Roman Republic are impossible to ignore. In this context, Cato's example raises uncomfortable questions. Should those who value democratic norms maintain absolute opposition to leaders who violate those norms, even if that opposition is politically ineffective? Should we refuse all compromise with those we consider threats to democracy, or should we make strategic alliances to prevent worse outcomes? Should we witness to our principles through symbolic acts of resistance, or should we focus on pragmatic strategies that might actually work? These are not merely academic questions. They are urgent practical dilemmas that determine how we respond to political crisis. Cato's life suggests several principles that might guide our responses, though applying these principles requires more flexibility than Cato himself displayed. First, integrity matters. In a culture where lying has become normal, where politicians routinely say things they know to be false, where consistency is viewed as weakness and shamelessness as strength, maintaining basic honesty becomes a form of resistance. This does not mean being naively transparent about everything or failing to engage in normal political strategy. But it does mean maintaining some core of authenticity, some realm where you will not lie even if lying would be convenient. Cato showed that this kind of integrity is possible even in the most corrupt environments. Second, not all compromise is corruption. This is something Cato failed to understand, and we should learn from his failure. Political systems require people to work together despite disagreements. This means sometimes voting for imperfect solutions, sometimes allying with people who do not share all your values, sometimes accepting partial victories instead of demanding total success. Learning to distinguish between necessary compromise and moral corruption is essential for effective political action. Third, witness has value, even when it accomplishes nothing immediate. When institutions are failing and norms are collapsing, simply modeling better behavior matters. It keeps alive the memory of how things should be. It prevents complete moral collapse. It shows that alternatives are possible. Cato understood this, and his example has inspired resistance to tyranny for 2,000 years. But witness should not become an excuse for ineffectiveness. The goal should be both to maintain your principles and to accomplish practical good, and when those come into tension, you need wisdom to navigate between them. Fourth, individual virtue is not enough to save failing systems. Cato tried to preserve the Republic through personal example and moral leadership, and he failed because the problems were structural rather than merely moral. No amount of individual virtue could fix the fundamental contradictions in Rome's political economy. The enormous inequality, the private armies, the concentration of power in the hands of military strongmen. Modern democracies face similar structural problems that cannot be solved by individual moral improvement alone. We need institutional reform, not just better leaders. Fifth, absolutism is dangerous even when motivated by principle. Cato's uncompromising opposition to Caesar probably made Caesar's rise easier by preventing the formation of effective republican coalitions. His refusal to work with people he considered corrupt meant that the field was left to those who had no such scruples. Sometimes, fighting effectively for good causes requires tolerating imperfect allies and accepting incremental progress. Purity is not always the most moral stance. Sixth, understand the difference between defending institutions and defending the principles those institutions are supposed to embody. Cato conflated the Roman Republic's specific constitutional arrangements with the general principles of republican self-government. When the former proved unsustainable, he could not imagine alternative ways of realizing the latter. We should be attached to principles, not to particular institutional forms. When institutions fail, we need the creativity to imagine new ones that might serve the same principles better. Finally, remember that failure is sometimes inevitable, and that how you fail matters. Cato could not save the Republic, but he died in a way that gave meaning to his failure. He demonstrated that resistance was possible, that some values were worth dying for, that power had limits. In situations where success is impossible, this kind of meaningful failure may be the best available option. Not all situations can be won, but all situations can be faced with integrity. The danger in drawing lessons from Cato is that we might learn the wrong ones. We might conclude that uncompromising opposition is always virtuous, that compromise is always corruption, that losing with principle is better than winning with flexibility. These conclusions would be mistakes that would make us ineffective in precisely the ways that Cato was ineffective. The better lesson is more nuanced. Maintain your core principles while remaining strategically flexible about means. Recognize that politics requires coalition, building and compromise. Understand that witnessing to values and achieving practical results are both important, and develop the wisdom to know when each should take priority. Cato's life teaches us what absolute commitment to principle looks like. It is admirable, inspiring, and ultimately tragic. We should honor his example while recognizing its limitations. We should learn from both his successes, his integrity, his courage, his willingness to sacrifice everything for what he believed, and from his failures, his inflexibility, his political ineffectiveness, his inability to imagine alternatives to the dying system he was trying to preserve. At the heart of Cato's story lies a question that every person must answer for themselves. What are you willing to die for? This is not a question about bravery or dramatic gestures. It is a question about values, about what gives your life meaning, about what you consider more important than mere survival. Cato knew his answer with absolute clarity. He was willing to die for the Republic, for liberty, for the principle that free citizens should govern themselves rather than submit to a master. This clarity gave his life shape and purpose. It guided every decision, informed every action, provided a framework within which all his choices made sense. He knew who he was and what he stood for, and this knowledge liberated him even as it constrained him. Most people never develop this kind of clarity. They move through life without firmly establishing their values, without really testing whether they believe what they say they believe, without discovering what they would actually sacrifice for their stated principles. This is not necessarily a failing. Perhaps it is healthier to live with some ambiguity, some flexibility, some recognition that values are complex and situations require nuanced responses rather than absolute commitments. But there is also something admirable about Cato's clarity, even if we cannot or should not emulate it. He was not confused about what mattered. He did not deceive himself about his motivations. He did not wake up each morning wondering who he was or what his life was for. He had answered these questions definitively, and the answers shaped everything else. The problem is that the question, "What are you willing to die for?" can be answered badly. People throughout history have died for causes that were not worth dying for tribal loyalty, for irrational beliefs, for leaders who did not deserve their devotion, for principles that were actually vices disguised as virtues. The willingness to die for something does not make that thing valuable. What matters is whether the cause is genuinely worth the sacrifice. Was the Roman Republic worth dying for? This is harder to answer than it might seem. The Republic was deeply flawed, oligarchic, violent, built on slavery and conquest. It provided freedom and political participation for a small minority while oppressing the vast majority. Its vaunted liberty was really the liberty of aristocrats to compete with each other for power, while the poor suffered and the enslaved endured. From this perspective, Cato died for an unjust system that did not deserve his sacrifice. But Cato was not defending the Republic's flaws. He was defending its principles, the idea that citizens should govern themselves through law rather than submit to arbitrary power, that authority should be accountable rather than absolute, that there should be limits on what rulers can do to the ruled. These principles were worth defending, even if the Republic's actual implementation of them was imperfect. This raises a deeper question. Should we value principles even when the institutions that supposedly embody them fail to live up to those principles? Should we defend democracy even when democratic institutions are corrupted? Should we fight for liberty even when liberty is unequally distributed? Should we resist tyranny even when the alternatives to tyranny have their own forms of oppression? Cato's answer was yes. Principles matter, independent of their imperfect realization. The fact that the Republic was flawed did not make republicanism worthless. The fact that Roman liberty was limited did not make liberty as an ideal meaningless. The fact that republican institutions had become corrupt did not justify replacing them with autocracy. We should work to improve flawed systems, not abandon the principles those systems imperfectly represent. This is a defensible position, but it has dangerous implications. It can lead you to defend systems that are so corrupt they cannot be reformed. It can prevent you from recognizing when radical change is necessary. It can make you into a conservative defender of failing institutions rather than a visionary imaginer of better alternatives. Cato fell into this trap. He was so committed to defending the Republic that he could not imagine that something better might be possible, that new forms of governance might better serve the principles he valued. The eternal question, then, is not just, what are you willing to die for, but how do you know that what you are willing to die for is actually worth dying for? This question has no easy answer. It requires both firm commitment to principles and openness to the possibility that you might be wrong about which principles matter or how they should be realized. It requires both the courage to stand for something and the humility to recognize that standing for something does not make you infallible. Cato had courage, but lacked humility. He was absolutely certain he was right, and this certainty gave him strength, but also blinded him. He could not question his own assumptions, could not imagine that his understanding of the Republic might be limited, could not entertain the possibility that what he was fighting for might not be worth the cost he was paying. This made him a hero to those who shared his values but ineffective at actually preserving those values. The lesson is that commitment and questioning need to exist together. You need to care deeply about something to accomplish anything meaningful. But you also need to maintain enough intellectual humility to recognize when your commitments have become obstacles to your goals, when your methods are undermining your principles, when your certainty has blinded you to important truths. This balance is extraordinarily difficult to achieve. Most people fall to one side or the other. Either they commit to nothing deeply enough to matter, or they commit so deeply they become rigid and unable to learn. Cato fell on the second side. He achieved a kind of heroic integrity, but at the cost of wisdom and effectiveness. The eternal question remains, what are you willing to die for? And how do you know? Stoicism has always been a philosophy, particularly concerned with death. Unlike philosophical systems that treat death as an unfortunate interruption to be avoided through distraction or denial, Stoicism insists on keeping death constantly in view. The practice of meditating on mortality, of regularly reminding yourself that you will die, was central to Stoic training. This was not morbid obsession, but practical wisdom. By acknowledging death's inevitability, you could live more fully and freely in the time you had. Cato practiced this meditation throughout his life. The Stoics taught various techniques for this, imagining your own funeral, considering what you would do if today were your last day, reflecting on how little separates you from the dead, remembering that death is natural and therefore nothing to fear. These practices were designed to transform your relationship with mortality, to remove death's sting by fully accepting its reality. But Cato's final act suggests that even Stoic philosophy could not entirely eliminate the terror of death. His suicide was not the peaceful philosophical death that Socrates achieved. It was violent, desperate, grotesque. He stabbed himself, was saved against his will, and then tore open his own wounds to complete the job. This was not serene acceptance, but ferocious determination, not tranquil submission to necessity, but furious assertion of will. What should we make of this? Perhaps it reveals that Cato was not as perfect a Stoic as his admirers claimed, that he had not achieved the complete equanimity in the face of death that Stoic theory promised. Or perhaps it reveals something about Stoic philosophy itself, that its ideal of peaceful acceptance of death is achievable only in philosophical treatises, not in the messy reality of actual dying. The Stoics defended suicide under certain circumstances. They argued that when life could no longer be lived according to virtue, when external circumstances made the fulfillment of your duties impossible, when continuing to exist required you to compromise your principles, then choosing death was rational and permissible. The wise man knew when to exit life, just as he knew when to exit a theater, when staying longer would be inappropriate. But this cool, rational analysis of when suicide is justified misses something essential about the act. Suicide is not merely a logical decision based on circumstances. It is a violent assertion of will against the instinct for self-preservation. It is a refusal of the most basic human desire to continue existing. It requires a kind of psychological extremity that philosophy cannot fully capture or control. Cato's suicide was not just the wise man rationally choosing his exit point. It was a man in extremis, facing the total collapse of everything he had lived for, making a final desperate assertion that some things mattered more than life itself. It was not philosophy. It was passion, will, defiance, rage against the dying of the light. This makes Cato's death more human, but perhaps less admirable. The Stoic suicide who peacefully drinks hemlock like Socrates, who calmly accepts necessity and makes a philosophical exit, displays a kind of superhuman control that commands respect. But Cato's violent self-destruction displays something else: the terrible cost of living according to absolute principle in a world that does not recognize or reward such principle. The question of suicide raises difficult philosophical issues that the Stoics never fully resolved. If virtue is the only good, and if you can maintain virtue regardless of external circumstances, then why should you ever kill yourself? As long as you are alive, you retain the capacity for virtuous action. You can continue to fulfill your duties, continue to live according to reason, continue to develop your character. What circumstances could possibly justify abandoning these opportunities? The Stoic answer was that there are situations where continuing to live would require you to act viciously, where survival would come at the cost of virtue. But this seems to prove too much. If maintaining virtue in adverse circumstances is itself virtuous, then shouldn't you try to maintain it for as long as possible? Wouldn't the most virtuous choice be to endure even impossible circumstances rather than escaping through death? Cato faced this dilemma in its starkest form. He could have lived under Caesar's rule. Many honorable Romans did so and maintained their integrity despite serving an autocrat. Caesar was offering pardon. Cato could have accepted it, lived out his life in dignified retirement, perhaps even influenced Caesar's policies toward more just ends. Why was suicide necessary? The answer seems to be that Cato could not bear to live in a world where everything he had fought for was lost. This was not a rational calculation about virtue. It was an emotional reality. The Republic's death made his own life unendurable. This is understandable, deeply human, but it is not obviously philosophical. It suggests that Cato's commitment to the Republic was not really the preferred indifferent that Stoic theory claimed, but something more absolute, more emotionally central, more identity-defining. This reveals a tension in Stoicism that Cato's death makes impossible to ignore. The philosophy claims that externals are indifferent, that only virtue matters, that the wise man is happy regardless of circumstances. But if this were true, Cato should have been able to live contentedly under Caesar, secure in his own virtue, regardless of who ruled Rome. The fact that he could not do this shows that he had not achieved, or perhaps that no one can achieve, the complete indifference to externals that Stoicism promises. Perhaps the lesson is that philosophy has limits. It can guide you through ordinary difficulties, help you maintain perspective in challenging circumstances, provide framework for understanding suffering. But there are situations where philosophy breaks down, where the demands become too great, where theoretical principles cannot bear the weight of existential extremity. Cato reached this point. His philosophy could not save him from despair when everything he valued was destroyed. Or perhaps the lesson is different, that Cato's death was not a failure of philosophy, but its ultimate expression. By choosing death over submission, by preferring non-existence to existence on unacceptable terms, by making a final assertion of freedom when all other freedoms had been taken, he demonstrated that the human will is irreducible, that there is something in us that cannot be conquered, that even absolute power has limits. This is a powerful idea, and it is part of why Cato's death inspired so many later generations. But it is also a troubling idea, because it romanticizes suicide, treating death as a solution to political defeat. It suggests that when your cause is lost, when your principles are threatened, when you cannot have the world you want, death is a noble response. This is a philosophy of despair dressed up as a philosophy of freedom. The healthier response would be to recognize that sometimes you lose, that defeat does not eliminate all possibilities for virtue, that living to fight another day is often wiser than dramatic self-destruction. Cato's suicide was heroic in a sense, but it was also a kind of giving up, an admission that he could not imagine a meaningful life in Caesar's world. This failure of imagination was itself a failure of philosophy. After his death, Cato ceased to be a man and became a symbol. This transformation began immediately and continues to this day. But what exactly does Cato symbolize? Different generations have found different meanings in his story, projecting their own concerns onto his life and death. For the Romans who lived through the transition from republic to empire, Cato symbolized lost liberty. He represented everything the republic had been and everything the empire had destroyed. When people wanted to criticize the emperors without directly attacking them, they praised Cato. When they wanted to mourn the loss of political freedom, they invoked his memory. The symbol became more powerful than the reality, more useful than the actual historical person. During the Renaissance, when Europeans were rediscovering classical learning, Cato became a symbol of civic virtue and republican self-government. Thinkers like Machiavelli, and later the American founders, saw in Cato a model for the citizen statesman, someone who put the common good above private interest, who served the republic rather than using it for personal advancement, who was willing to sacrifice everything for political freedom. This republican Cato inspired the revolutions that created modern democracies. When American colonists resisted British authority, they invoked Cato's name and read plays about his death. When French revolutionaries overthrew the monarchy, they claimed to be following Cato's example. His story provided a template for principled resistance to tyranny, a reminder that liberty was worth fighting and dying for. But this symbolic Cato bears limited resemblance to the historical one. The real Cato was not a democrat. He was an aristocrat defending oligarchic institutions. He was not fighting for universal liberty, but for the specific privileges of the Roman senatorial class. He was not a progressive or revolutionary, but a conservative, trying to preserve traditional arrangements. Turning him into a symbol of democratic resistance required significant historical revisionism. In the 19th and 20th centuries, as European societies struggled with questions about individual liberty versus collective welfare, Cato became a symbol of individualism and resistance to state power. Libertarians and classical liberals saw in him a model of someone who would not submit to authority, who valued freedom above security, who insisted on his right to self-governance. This Cato was the eternal opponent of big government, the defender of individual rights against collective demands. Again, this symbolic use required ignoring much of the historical reality. Cato was not an individualist in the modern sense. He believed in subordinating individual interests to the republic's needs. He valued collective institutions and traditional authority. He thought individuals should fulfill their duties to the community, not pursue their private interests. The modern libertarian Cato is largely a fiction. More recently, Cato has been claimed by various political movements as a symbol of resistance to perceived tyranny. Conservatives invoke him when opposing government expansion. Progressives invoke him when resisting authoritarian leaders. Populists invoke him when attacking established elites. Each group finds in Cato what it wants to find, reshaping his story to fit contemporary political needs. This symbolic flexibility is both Cato's strength and his weakness as a historical figure. His strength is that his story contains enough ambiguity and complexity to speak to different situations and concerns. His life raises questions that remain relevant across very different historical contexts. How do you maintain integrity in corrupt systems? When is compromise appropriate and when is it betrayal? What are you willing to sacrifice for your principles? These are perennial questions that make Cato perpetually useful. But the weakness is that the symbol has overwhelmed the reality. We have lost sight of who Cato actually was in favor of who we want him to have been. We project our values onto him, use his name to authorize positions he might not have held, turn his complex and contradictory life into simple morality tales that serve our own purposes. The danger of symbols is that they flatten complexity. Real human beings are ambiguous, contradictory, shaped by circumstances we may not fully understand. Symbols are clear, one-dimensional, useful precisely because they eliminate nuance in favor of simple meanings. When Cato becomes a symbol, we lose access to the actual human being with all his struggles, failures, and limitations. Yet perhaps this transformation is inevitable and even necessary. History serves the needs of the living, not the dead. We study past figures not primarily to understand them on their own terms, but to help us navigate our own situations. If Cato's story provides inspiration for resistance to tyranny, does it matter that the historical Cato was more complicated than the symbolic one? If his example encourages people to value integrity and principle, should we worry about historical accuracy? These are difficult questions without clear answers. On one hand, there is value in myth and symbol even when they diverge from historical reality. Stories shape how we understand ourselves and what we aspire to become. If Cato's story inspires people to act courageously, to resist injustice, to maintain their principles in difficult circumstances, then the story serves an important function regardless of its accuracy. On the other hand, there are dangers in mythologizing. When we turn historical figures into one-dimensional heroes, we lose the complexity that makes their stories truly instructive. We miss the lessons that come from understanding their failures, their limitations, their struggles with impossible choices. We create impossible standards that real humans cannot meet, and we oversimplify situations that actually require nuanced response. The challenge is to hold both the symbol and the reality in mind simultaneously, to be inspired by what Cato represents while understanding the complications of what he actually was. This requires a kind of intellectual flexibility that is difficult to maintain. It is much easier to either embrace the myth uncritically or to debunk it cynically. But the truth is that Cato was neither the perfect Stoic hero nor a deluded failure. He was a human being trying to do right in impossible circumstances, succeeding in some ways and failing in others, providing both inspiration and cautionary warning. What, in the end, was Cato's philosophy? It was not primarily a set of abstract doctrines about metaphysics, epistemology, or logic, though it included all of these. It was not primarily a systematic ethics, though it was built on Stoic ethical principles. At its core, Cato's philosophy was a lived demonstration of what human freedom could mean when pushed to its absolute limit. The Stoics had taught that true freedom is internal, that no external force can enslave the will that chooses virtue. Cato tested this teaching in the hardest possible circumstances and proved it true in the only way it could be proven, by living it and dying by it. He showed that even when everything else has been taken, property, position, homeland, hope, one thing remains: the choice of how to respond. This is the essence of human dignity as Cato understood it. Not that we can control what happens to us. We cannot. but that we can control what we make of what happens to us. Not that we can prevent defeat, often we cannot, but that we can choose how to meet defeat. Not that we can save everything we love, sometimes we cannot, but that we can remain true to ourselves even as everything we love is destroyed. This is a hard philosophy, perhaps the hardest philosophy ever devised. It offers no comfort, no hope of external salvation, no promise that virtue will be rewarded or vice punished. It says only you have freedom, and that freedom is enough. Use it well or use it poorly. That is the only choice that truly matters. Cato used his freedom to resist tyranny, to witness for republican values, to demonstrate that submission is never inevitable. He made himself into a standing reproach to everyone who claimed that circumstances forced them to compromise, that practical necessity required abandonment of principle, that survival justified any betrayal. He proved that these claims were lies, that there was always an alternative, that freedom remained real even when every external freedom had been eliminated. But Cato's philosophy also reveals freedom's limits. His absolute commitment to freedom made him unable to adapt, unable to compromise, unable to imagine life on any terms except his own. His freedom became a prison of its own, trapping him in rigid patterns that prevented genuine human connection and effective political action. He was so determined to be free that he made himself into a slave to his own principles. This suggests that freedom is more complex than either Stoic philosophy or modern individualism acknowledges. Complete freedom is not the highest human good, because humans are social beings who need connection, cooperation, and occasionally the ability to subordinate their will to others. The completely free individual, the person who never compromises or adapts or bends, is not fully human. Such a person has achieved a kind of godlike independence, but at the cost of the messy interdependence that makes us who we are. Yet Cato's extremism serves an important purpose. By pushing freedom to its limit, by showing what total commitment to principle looks like, he clarifies the stakes and reveals possibilities that more moderate approaches obscure. Most of us will never need to choose death over compromise. Most of us will navigate through life making reasonable accommodations, strategic retreats, necessary compromises. Though we need people like Cato to remind us that these compromises are choices, that we could choose differently, that freedom is always real, even when we choose not to exercise it. Cato's final truth about freedom is that it is terrifying. This is why most people flee from it, into the comfortable certainties of dogma, tradition, or submission to authority. To be truly free is to bear full responsibility for who you are and what you do. It is to recognize that you cannot blame circumstances, genetics, upbringing, or society for your choices. It is to stand alone before the void of possibility and choose, knowing that your choice will define you and that there is no authority higher than yourself to validate that choice. This terror of freedom drove Cato to his death, not because he was a coward, but because he was brave enough to face freedom's full reality. When the Republic fell, when the structures that had given his life meaning collapsed, when the external scaffolding that had supported his identity was removed, Cato was left facing the naked reality of his own freedom. And what he saw was unbearable, that he could choose to go on living, could choose to submit to Caesar, could choose to compromise and adapt and survive. The fact that he could choose these things made them intolerable. So he chose the only option that allowed him to escape from freedom's burden. He chose not to be. This was both Cato's triumph and his tragedy. Triumph because he proved that human freedom is real, that the will cannot be broken unless we allow it to break. Tragedy because he proved that freedom at its limit becomes unbearable, that the weight of total responsibility can crush even the strongest spirit, that sometimes the burden of choice is too heavy to carry. We are left with Cato's legacy, a life lived in absolute commitment to freedom's truth, and a death that revealed freedom's terror. Neither his life nor his death provides a simple model for how we should live. Both are too extreme, too demanding, too inhuman to serve as everyday guides. But together they illuminate the human condition in ways that more moderate examples cannot. They show us the heights we could reach and the costs of reaching them. They reveal the glory and the burden of being the kind of creature that can choose its own path and bear responsibility for that choice. In the end, Cato teaches us that freedom is not a comfortable condition or a political arrangement or a philosophical doctrine. It is a terrible gift that makes us human, that distinguishes us from all other beings, that is both our greatest power and our heaviest burden. It is what makes virtue possible and what makes virtue necessary. It is what allows us to transcend our circumstances and what makes those circumstances matter. It is, finally, the truth about ourselves that we spend most of our lives trying to avoid. The truth that Cato faced completely and that destroyed him, even as it proved him indestructible. This is the philosophy of Cato the Younger, not a system or doctrine, but a life lived at the extreme edge of what human freedom means, a death chosen freely when freedom was the only thing left to choose. It is a philosophy for everyone and for no one, relevant to every time, and impossible to practice in any time. It is the philosophy of Rome's last free man, the philosophy of absolute principle in a world of necessary compromise, the philosophy of perfect virtue in an imperfect world. It is, in short, the philosophy of a man who would rather cease to exist than exist on terms he could not accept. Whether this makes him a hero or a failure, whether we should admire or pity him, whether his example inspires or appalls, these are questions each person must answer alone in the exercise of the very freedom that Cato died to prove was real.